Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Diary of a Lawyer. And today I want to briefly talk about the key aspects as an overview of the right to education, the international legal framework. Education is not a privilege. I think that's surprisingly should be common knowledge, but it turns out it's not always in practice. It's a human right, and education as a human right means that the right to education is legally guaranteed for all without discrimination. Um, uh, States have a legal obligation to protect, respect, and fulfill the right to education, and there are ways to hold states accountable for violation or deprivation of the right to education. So, and how and where is the right to education guaranteed? I think various organizations have done a lot of work on this, such as the organization called the Right to Education, the United Nations, and other many organizations. So and there's a lot of literature in relation to the legal framework. So I'm sort of using this as a reference point in this specific edition. So, um, w- back to the question is where is the right to education guaranteed and how is so international human rights law guarantees the right to education. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948, proclaims in Article 26 that everyone has the right to education. And since then, um, the right to education has been significantly recognized and developed by a number of international, what is termed as quote unquote normative instruments that are elaborated by the United Nations, including such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which was 1966, abbreviated as CESCR, the Convention on the Rights of a Child, 1989, which we touched on briefly in other episodes, and the UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education in 1960, which is abbreviated CADE. Now, also, it is important to note that the right to education is reaffirmed in other treaties covering specific groups, where women and girls, persons with disabilities, migrants, refugees, indigenous peoples, among other more sort of disadvantaged groups. And there are also other contexts that cover education, such as during armed conflicts. And this has also been incorporated into a number of regional treaties that are enshrined as a right in the vast majority of national institutions. There's for example, the European framework, the African framework. There's a slightly more shorter version in Asia, not a general framework as such, and the Inter-American framework. So, I mean, it should be obvious as to why the right to education is fundamental, but it empowers the individual and society. It lifts marginalized groups and individuals out of poverty. It's also, at least according to this organization, I believe so, it's an indispensable means of realizing other rights. If someone can read and write and advocate and research, they can advocate and be a voice for themselves and others. So education is significant, and also it contributes to the full development of the human personality, and that's Um, that's self-evident. But the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights has details commentary on this issue as to why this is important. But it should be straightforward, but it is more crystallized when it's put in those terms. Now, what is the content? I mean, what informs, what is embedded into the right to education? Now we hear the phrase the right to education, but what does it actually mean? What encompasses that? So, how can it be? What are the ABCDs that make up the right to education? So, the right to free and compulsory primary education, the right to available and accessible secondary education, including technical vocational training, which is, ideally, well, at least in terms of the um, instruments, free, although we know in practice that is not always the case. The right to access higher education on the basis of capacity, again, in terms of the encompassment or ideal, free. The right to fundamental education for those who have not received a complete primary education. The right to quality education, both in public and private schools. Freedom of parents to choose schools for their children, which are in conformity with their religious and moral convictions. Um, Freedom of individuals and bodies to establish and direct education institutions in conformity with minimum standards established by the state. And believe it or not, academic freedom of teachers and students, although we know that that is in some areas constantly under attack. We've had books being banned, curriculums being, cut out and revised, etc., etc. Um, these within this sort of educational subject is what is termed as the four A's. So, and these were developed by the first UN rapporteur on the right to education, Katrina Tomaszewski, and adopted by the Committee on the Economic and Social Rights in its General Comment 13 of the Right to Education, according to the organization Right to Education. And is for education to be a meaningful right. Education in all its forms and all levels shall exhibit the interrelated essential features. It should be available, i.e., free, and there's infrastructure and trained teachers to support the delivery of education. It should be accessible. The education, in other words, the education system should not be non-discriminatory and accessible to all, positives taken to include the most marginalized. It should be acceptable. The content of education is relevant, non-discriminatory, and culture appropriate. And the quality, schools are safe and teachers are professional. And it should be adaptable. Education evolves with the changing needs of society and challenges inequalities such as gender discrimination. Education adapts to suit locally specific needs and context. And again, these are set out in the book or in a writing literature called Human Rights Obligations, Making Education Available, Accessible, Acceptable, and Adaptable, RTE, Katerina Tomaszewski, 2011. Now, there are a number of obligations by states or countries. They're very sort of comprehensive, but we just summarize it. Respect, protect, and fulfill. That's straightforward. In other words, refrain from interfering with the enjoyment of the right, prevent others from interfering with the enjoyment of the right, usually through regulation and legal rights, and adopt appropriate measures towards the full realization of the right to education. And there are also some immediate and progressive obligations. So to ensure minimum core obligations are made to take appropriate steps towards the realization of the right to education and not to take retrogressive measures, in that should take backwards or adapt measures that fulfill existing guarantees of the right to education. Again, it's in current times, we've seen what's happening in some areas where historical books are banned, teachers feel under threat, tenures threatened, and it's just it's one of those things that this reference um, refers to others. In other words, not to take retrogressive measures, and there are also responsibilities for stakeholders. There are many, there are the various stakeholders. We can again going to be fairly uh, brief. So states have a primary duty to ensure the right to education. However, there are other actors that have a role in promoting those rights and protecting those rights. And according to international law, the actors have responsibilities in upholding the right to education. So there's a role for multilateral intergovernmental agencies such as UNESCO, the OHCR, which is responsible for human rights, UNICEF, etc., the international financial institutions, private businesses, which have the responsibility to respect human rights and avoid infringing on the rights of others. Civil society clearly plays a crucial role in promoting the right to education. Maybe that's what we're doing on this podcast. And parents have the right to ensure their children attend compulsory education. They cannot deny their children access to education. Um, that is true, but again, we are saying where, in some cases, especially kids with special needs, it's the other way around, where they're being excluded, but they are higher exclusion rates for some, disproportionately exclusion rates for some racial minorities in some countries, it's a matter of public records. So yes, parents have the right, sorry, have the responsibility to ensure that the children go to school, but I think in many instances it's the children that are being failed by the system and education system. I think there was a report just recently by United Nations where it did a very thorough review of such practices in somewhere in I think that was in the UK. But what are the violations of the right to education? We know what the rights are, we know the responsibilities. What are these sort of violations, I think, in a legal context? So the violations of the right to education may occur through direct action of state parties, characterized as commission, or through failure as omission. So either inaction, action, commission, or omission. And there are various concrete examples which are given. We can briefly go through them if we may, just briefly. And these were adopted by the Committee on Social and Cultural Rights, which provide interpretation and clarification of Article 13 of the International Convention on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. So General Comment 13 of the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights provides interpretation and clarification of Article 13 of that article, which gives very specific examples of how those rights could be violated. We shall do that on another episode, but that's a reference that's made there. Now, it should be noted that yes, there may be failures, such as what the UN said. Many countries have ratified these international treaties. They recognize the full right to education, and in most cases, they do their best to ensure that this is hard. Certainly, yes, there may be some issues, for example, in the UK, but by and large, that right is there. And the system in particular, especially, needs to be improved as a matter of public record and recognized by parents and other institutions. But most of the children and adults who do not fully enjoy the right to education globally belong to the most deprived and marginal groups of society, which are often left behind in national policies. Again, that's just a general observation globally, not specific to a specific country. And how could we help? How could you or me or any other person help in ensuring that the right to education is realized, given the key that it's the way out of lifting people's voices, the human dignity and the human person, not just for the individual, but for the community. So raise awareness on the right to education. If individuals know their rights, they are empowered to claim them. Monitor the implementation of the right to education and report regularly on deprivations and violations. Advocate and campaign for the full implementation of the right to education, holding the state accountable. Seek remedies when there are violations of the right to education. And so these are some of the ways that could be used in terms of the practical ways how one could advocate for the right to education. But that's it, sort of in a nutshell, as an overview of the right to education. We will be covering specific issues under this right. It's a very, very wide subject, such as special needs law, and other related education related subjects. But on this episode, that's where we shall leave it, on the Diary of a Lawyer, and we will speak again and cover various aspects and specific points in relation to education. And so there we shall leave it on this episode of the Diary of a Lawyer. Thanks for listening, and we'll speak again. Thank you. Bye.